an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Evening all, welcome to This Week. A week in which a bunch of loser jihadists slaughtered 132 innocents in Paris to prove the future belongs to them, rather than a civilization like France. Well, I can't say I fancy their chances. France, the country of Descartes, Boulez, Monet, Sartre, Rousseau, Camus, Renoir, Berlioz, Cézanne, Gauguin, Hugo, Voltaire, Matisse, Debussy, Ravel, Saint-Saëns, Bizet, Satie, Pasteur, Molière, Frank, Zola, Balzac, Poulenc, cutting-edge science, world-class medicine, fearsome security forces, nuclear power, Coco Chanel, Chateau Lafite, Coco Van, Daft Punk, Zizou Zidane, Juliette Binoche, liberty, equality, fraternity, and creme brulee. Versus what? Beheadings, crucifixions, amputations, slavery, mass murder, medieval squalor, a death cult barbarity that would shame the Middle Ages. Well, IS or Daesh or ISIS or ISIL or whatever name you're going by, I'm sticking with IS, as in Islamist scumbags. I think the outcome is pretty clear to everybody but you. Whatever atrocities you're currently capable of committing, you will lose. In 1,000 years' time, Paris, that glorious city of lights, will still be shining bright, as will every other city like it, while you will be as dust, along with a ragbag of fascists, Nazis and Stalinists that have previously dared to challenge democracy and failed. Speaking of those who couldn't tell their Chateau Latour from their Blue Nun, I'm joined on the sofa tonight by a two-fingered salute to the fanatics. Think of them as the F and the off of late-night political chat. I speak, of course, of hashtag 4% Les Miserables Kendall and hashtag sad man on a TGV, Michael Choo Choo Portillo. Michael, your moment related to the terrible events in Paris and the aftermath.
I think it's almost invidious to choose a moment because the suffering of so many people has been so very intense. I suppose just one moment that was described and which struck me very forcibly was a lady at the rock concert who fell under a man who'd been murdered, I think a large, heavy man, and who then lay there for about the next 2 hours listening to other people in the concert hall being shot and listening to explosions and aware that they were going around checking on who was dead and who was pretending to be dead. She was pretending to be dead. And yet she survived. But I mean, it's quite inhuman to imagine.
Unimaginable.
Unimaginable to go through such an experience.
Liz.
The response of the French police and the French forces, the numbers they were able to deploy, the swiftness and determination of their response and their sheer bravery. I know some people who work in the French police, and their bravery to me and what they have to face and go through is something that really I have found awesome this week.
Okay, I think the French people probably agree with that too. Now, in response to Friday's mass murder in Paris, the French launched further airstrikes on the Islamic State stronghold of Raqqa in Syria. President Hollande says his country is at war and vowed to destroy the terror group. In Britain, the question of how to eradicate the threat is proving controversial, and debate rages over whether we should bomb Islamic State in Syria and not just in Iraq as we do at present. But would further airstrikes be enough? Our former commander in Afghanistan, an expert on counterinsurgency, Colonel Richard Kemp, doesn't think so. This is his take of the week.
In the wake of the attacks in Paris last Friday, the West is left with a choice. We can either stand and fight, or we can roll over and let the Islamic State flourish. As Manuel Valls, the French Prime Minister, said this weekend, we have been hit by an act of war, organised methodically by a terrorist jihadist army. The faint-hearted, fearful of further jihadist attacks, advocate appeasing the Islamic State. But that will not stop the radicals from murdering the innocents. This is no time for fear. Islamic State must be crushed. France was right to order immediate retaliatory airstrikes against the Islamic State in Syria. And now is the time for concerted NATO action to eradicate them. But in the entirety of military history, air power alone has never been enough to defeat military forces that hold ground. We need boots on the ground in Iraq and in Syria. Yes, there will be a cost, probably in the form of civilian casualties, military deaths, and the provocation of further attacks. But the alternative is much worse. We allow the Islamic State to flourish, and they will attack us anyway. We also need to take decisive action at home, where opinion polls show frightening levels of support for the Islamic State by non-extremist Muslims. We must protect ourselves. Anybody who leaves to fight for the Islamic State in Syria or Iraq should not be permitted to come back home. And anybody who is not a citizen of the UK, who represents a threat to our country, should be expelled. These measures may sound draconian, but in the face of bloodlust and subjugation, the cause is worth the casualties. I would prefer to see decisive action than innocent men, women and children lying bleeding and dying in our streets.
And from toy soldiers to our dad's army here in Westminster, Colonel Richard Kemp joins us now. Colonel Kemp, before we come on to the points in your film, you're a counter-terrorism expert. Has there, as it increasingly seems there was, been a serious failure of French intelligence?
Were you saying I was Dad's army?
No, definitely not. I'm speaking about him.
That makes more sense. I think there has been a failure of security, and I don't know where you attribute it to. I think what you have to look at is the position of France as a nation with open borders all around it.
And lots of countries around it too.
Yes, exactly. And I think that we're very fortunate here in the UK, as much as we have maintained the control of our borders, the French haven't. And therefore people are moving in and out with relative impunity. I think that is one of the biggest problems. One of the main issues as well is the fact that there are so many targets in France for the French police and intelligence services to handle. I think there are thousands of people who are involved in radical activity, many hundreds of which have been out to fight in Iraq and Syria and have come home, very dangerous people.
They're sort of battle-hardened in a sense.
They've got blood on their hands, they've taken part in killing, and once they've done that, it's much easier for them to kill again, as we saw in Paris on Friday.
But it did seem surprising, the ringleader, this Abdelhamid Aboud, he was a known plotter and a terrorist. He was subject of an international arrest warrant, yet he was able to move easily between Syria and France and Belgium. That's got to be, I know it's hard for the intelligence forces, of course, to keep an eye, but that's got to be filed under F for failure.
I agree, but it's, I would say, more a failure of the government than the intelligence services. The government needs to close those borders down and control movement in and out. Yes, I've no doubt there are lessons to be learned.
Schengen gone, in your view?
Should be gone, I think.
Okay.
There are lessons to be learned by the police and the intelligence services and coordination between different countries. But my experience working with French intelligence is they're extremely professional, extremely effective organisation, who obviously, like everyone else, makes errors because intelligence is far from an exact science.
Let's come on to the argument of the take. Michael, is Richard Kemp right when he says air attacks alone have never been enough to defeat those who hold the ground? So to defeat IS, we need boots on the ground.
Undoubtedly, you need some boots on the ground. I think my order of priority would be to say the first thing is we have to make an accord with the Russians. Richard Kemp mentioned NATO, but I think it has to be beyond NATO. It has to involve the Russians. If we were able to deal with Joe Stalin during the war, I don't see why we can't deal with Vladimir Putin now. And having established a coalition, then I think we need to look at what our resources are. I mean, there are people fighting on the ground. There's Assad's army, which is fighting on the ground. There are Kurds who are fighting on the ground. I think we need to assess what their capabilities are.
And there's the Iraqi army to some extent.
I certainly think that, the present situation clearly is one in which hundreds of people are moving between the United Kingdom and other EU countries and Syria and coming back battle-hardened, as Colonel Kemp describes it, and therefore represent a threat. And therefore, it is our duty to see whether we can close down the Syrian situation. Now, all of this is rather pie in the sky because it seems to me there is no prospect of President Obama participating in an operation which involves Allied boots on the ground. And so I fear that for the moment, we're dreaming about these situations. So I think I would say in the first instance, let's see what NATO plus Russia, plus Kurds, plus Assad, plus the others can put together.
I think Michael's right about the need to have an accord with Russia, because Russia is now calling the shots in Syria. We couldn't possibly deploy military forces into Syria to attack the Islamic State, wherever those forces come from, without coordinating with Russia. It wouldn't be able to happen nowadays. What's
your response, Liz, to what Richard Kemp was arguing?
Ultimately, I agree that ground forces may be required. The question is, though, whether that can be provided by countries in the region. And I think that has got to be part of the thinking, certainly that the Prime Minister does when he presents a strategy to Parliament, as he has said he'll do.
The problem is it's hard to find out who in the region will be prepared to provide ground forces.
Indeed.
And they're providing some air cover at the moment.
That's right. I mean, we have seen what some of the Kurdish forces are able to do with air cover. Whether their role can be expanded more broadly, I think, is open to question. But really a long-term solution, I think you're right, ultimately ground forces will be needed. But I don't see those coming from the UK or the US.
Do you accept I mean, even if you're right, even if you were right that you need to put boots in the ground, they're after Iraq and Afghanistan. There's just no political will to do that.
No, and I think it should be an absolute last resort to deploy Western forces into Syria and into Iraq in any more numbers than they are now. I think what we haven't explored fully enough, perhaps, is the use of some of the Sunni tribes in both Syria and Iraq in the similar way to that which General Petraeus and the Americans very successfully did to defeat Al-Qaeda prior to this whole problem with Islamic State. And I think that is an area that should be one of the first options. I don't think the use of the Kurds more widely outside Kurdish areas is feasible.
Well, they have no appetite for that anyway.
They absolutely don't.
And the problem with the Sunni tribes now is that the Shia-led government in Baghdad didn't, abandon them, didn't treat them well.
Well, that's right, and that's got to be addressed. But and in Syria as well, I think there's the same kind of tribal structure exists across the border, and those would be the perfect people to do it if it could be arranged and orchestrated. I'm not saying it could be, and I think the next option, if that is not possible, is at least limited but very severe hit-and-run operations by Western forces if necessary. I don't think
to degrade their command and control and supply lines.
I don't think we should be in the business of deploying massive forces to hold ground and to control the country. But I think the problem is if we don't deal with Islamic State now, it's not just what they're doing to people in the region. It's not just the fact they're sending out groups to attack us in Paris or London. It's also the inspiration they're giving to other extremists around the world. If they're not shown to be defeatable, if they continue to appear to be kind of supermen, then that inspiration is going to get even worse and become a much bigger problem.
Should the Prime Minister go ahead and order bombing raids in Syria without a vote in the Commons? Constitutionally, he doesn't need it. He may be subject to a vote of confidence eventually, but shouldn't a leader, if he believes it's the right thing to do, if that's what he says, shouldn't he do that and then deal with the consequences of a vote of confidence?
Right now, because of what's happened in Paris, and listening, for instance, to the sort of things that Liz says, and listening to what some other people in the Labour Party say, and even listening to what Nicola Sturgeon has said, I think he feels that he has a chance of winning the vote if he makes a proper explanation in the House of Commons. And that should certainly be his first port of call. And I think he will be in some difficulty if he goes ahead without a vote in the Commons, if only because he's pledged again and again that the vote in the Commons for him would be decisive. I might say that whether the British participate in the air raids or not, it seems to me makes no military difference. But it makes quite a big psychological difference. The reason the Prime Minister wants to participate is that he feels he must be alongside our allies, the French and the Americans in particular. and as they might become, the Russians in due course might become our allies too.
If the Prime Minister gives a credible case for extending British bombing into Syria, would you vote for it?
If he can show how it is part of a wider strategy, that there's a commitment to some kind of roadmap to a political settlement, humanitarian aid, and crucially a real effort on reconstruction, which was the lesson we learnt from Iraq, then yes, I would support it.
Are you confident that the West, with what allies it has in the region, will step up to the plate here? Monsieur Hollande is trying to put together a grand coalition going to Moscow, Washington. Not sure he's even coming to London. Are you confident that this will be dealt with? Because it would seem to me that Islamic State, in control of Iraq and Syria, with the oil and resources that has, parts of it, is a much bigger threat than Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan.
It absolutely is, and I'm far from confident that we will step up. I think, as Michael said earlier, I think President Obama has no appetite to engage in this fight with US military forces.
He has stepped up the air attacks, though.
He has, but it's still pretty token, I think. I mean, it's been going on a long time, and it's half-hearted. It's not done what it needed to have done, and even if it's intensified much greater than it is at present, I still don't believe that air attacks alone are going to deal with Islamic State. There's got to be preferably regional ground forces, but also backed up by, at least by military advisors and coordinators to coordinate airstrikes, artillery, etc., in support of the regional forces.
Richard Kemp, thank you for being with us.
I've been getting